Shabbat Shalom. Today's Torah portion is the third in the yearly reading cycle. It's Parashat Lech Lecha, which means go forth. It's rather a long one. It's covering chapters 12 through 17 of Bereshit or Genesis, and it's mostly about Abraham. It begins with Adonai calling to Abraham. Abraham is now 75 years old and Sarah is 65, and God tells Abraham, "Get going out from your land and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. My heart's desire is to make you into a great nation, to bless you and to make your name great, so that you may be a blessing." Verse 3 then states, "My desire is to bless those who bless you, but whoever curses you, I will curse." This verse is particularly significant because it shows God's heart for Israel through Abraham. A curse against Israel is a curse against God. So Abraham at this point obeys the call. In fact, he had already traveled with his father and family from Ur of the Chaldeans, which is in modern-day Iraq, to Haran in modern-day Turkey. Now, with this specific call from Hashem, Abraham continues to travel south towards Canaan, making several stops. And at each stop, Abraham builds an altar to Adonai and calls on the name of Adonai. At some point, there is a severe famine in Canaan. So Abraham and Sarai, his wife, continue to travel south to Egypt. As they approach the border, Abraham decides that Egypt's culture is barbaric, and for this reason the Egyptians will kill him in order to have his beautiful wife. So his solution is based on this assumption about the strangers: say that she is my sister, but not that she is my wife. So Sarai does this, and it works for a while. Sarai is taken into Pharaoh's house, and Abraham is showered with all kinds of gifts in exchange. But the truth has a way of coming out, and God strikes Pharaoh and his household with great plagues because of Sarai. When Pharaoh figures out the truth, he tells Abraham and tells him to leave. So Abraham, Sarai, and Lot, Abraham's nephew, who has been traveling with him from the beginning, leave with all of their possessions and go up from the Negev back to Bethel, the place where Abraham had originally set up an altar. According to Torah, at this point, Abraham is rich with silver, gold, and livestock, and Lot also has many possessions. There's not enough land for both of them to support all their possessions, all their flocks and everything. So Abraham generously allows Lot to make the first choice of where he would like to settle. And Lot chooses the very green and fertile Jordan Valley. And Abraham returns to Canaan, a place more prone to drought and famine. He eventually settles in Hebron, which is south of Jerusalem in the West Bank, and builds another altar to Adonai. Meanwhile, with Lot, after separating from Abraham, he moves his tents from place to place, eventually settling in the cities that comprise the kingdoms of Sodom and Gomorrah. We're all familiar with the tales of Sodom and Gomorrah because they're of their very unsavory reputation and what happened to them as a result. Torah here describes them as very great sinners against Adonai. During this period of history, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and 3 other kings ruled much of the region north and east of Canaan, but were constantly warring, acquiring more territory, and exacting tribute. After 12 years, 5 of those kingdoms, which included the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, rebelled. So Chedorlaomer and his compatriots went after the insurgents to quell their insubordination. The battle lines were drawn at the Valley of Sittim, a ratio of 4 kings to 5. Now, the Valley of Sittim was full of tar pits, and in the ensuing battle, the northern kingdoms of King Chedorlaomer et al. Beat the other kingdoms, the other 5 kingdoms, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah with their armies fled, many falling into their pits. Meanwhile, King Chedorlaomer acquired the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, as well as Lot and all of his possessions. When Abraham heard of it, he rallied the fighting men of his household, 318 in all, and pursued them at night, soundly defeating them. He brought back Lot and all of his possessions, as well as the women and other people. After these events, the king of Sodom, who survived the tar pits, approached Abraham in the valley of Shaveh near the city of Salem in order to recover possessions he assumed Abraham had taken in the spoil. At that meeting, we are introduced to Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, who is both king of Salem and priest of El Elyon, God Most High. In Hebrews 7 verse 3, Melchizedek is described as without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like Ben Elohim, he remains a Cohen forever. He brings out bread and wine and blesses Abraham, and Abraham in turn gives a tenth of all of his possessions to Melchizedek. This brings us to chapter 15 with the cutting of a covenant. Adonai says to Abraham, "Do not fear, Abraham, I am your shield, your very great reward." But Abraham takes the reward as relating to the promise of descendants, but wonders, "What will you give me, since I have no children, and my heir is my servant Eliezer of Damascus. This leads to Adonai's promise to Abraham that he will provide an heir from Abraham's loins, whose seed will be as numerous as the stars. Abraham believes Adonai and Torah when he says, he, Adonai, reckoned it to him as righteousness. Adonai established himself as the one who called Abram out of Ur of the Chaldeans, specifically to give Abram the land to inherit. We see over and over in the Tanakh that when Adonai wishes to establish a relationship with us, he does it through a covenant. He made a covenant with Noah not to destroy the earth with a flood ever again. But here God makes a covenant with Abram, which signifies that he has given Abram and his descendants the land of Canaan as an inheritance. To ratify the covenant, Abram is instructed to bring a 3-year-old cow, female goat and ram, and 1 turtle dove and 1 young bird. All but the bird are cut in half and the animal pieces and birds are placed opposite each other. When the sunset approaches, Abram falls into a deep sleep accompanied by a terrifying darkness. In this state, he is given the prophecy of his descendants experiencing slavery and oppression in another land for 400 years, after which they are brought back with great possessions to the land of Canaan, the promised land. We recognize this, of course, as foreshadowing for the story of Exodus and the exile in Egypt. When the sun is completely set, so it is completely dark, a smoking oven and a fiery torch passes between the animal pieces. On that day, Torah says, Adonai maps out the boundaries of the land from the Nile to the Mediterranean Sea, called the Great Sea in Scripture, to the river Euphrates that runs through Iraq, Syria, and ends in Turkey. So far, as you can see, Israel is nowhere near that size. In chapter 16, it's recounted the incidents surrounding Hagar and Ishmael. 10 years have passed since Hashem promised to give Avram an heir. Sarai is past childbearing at 75 years of age. It's important to note that it's not Avram but Sarai who has resigned herself to her barren state. And she is also the originator of the scheme to produce an heir out of her own natural desire to have children. So she proposes that Hagar, her Egyptian handmaiden, become a wife to Avram to produce an heir that would be counted as Sarai's child. Avram complies, suggesting he also assumes that this is the logical way to get an heir out of his own body. Hagar becomes pregnant, and when she sees that she can become pregnant, Sarai is belittled in her eyes. According to Strong's Concordance, the Hebrew verb translated belittled, kalal, means to esteem lightly or to be treated with contempt. Naturally, this is galling to Sarai, who in turn blames Avram. Avram points out that since Hagar is under her authority, not his, Sarai can deal with Hagar as she pleases. Hagar eventually escapes the wilderness, where the angel of the Lord finds her and gives her a prophecy. She is pregnant, and she will have a son, whom she shall name Ishmael, because Adonai heard your affliction. Hagar is instructed to humble herself and return to Sarai, which she does. In due time, she gives birth to Ishmael. Avram is now 86, and Sarai is 76. Now in chapter 17, the last chapter of this portion, the covenant of circumcision is detailed. Again, 13 more years pass, and Avram is now 99. Adonai appears to him as El Shaddai, the sufficient one. He again expresses his desire to make a covenant with Avram to make him a father of a multitude of nations. To that end, God will change Avram's name to Abraham. Avram means eternal father, and Abraham means father of a multitude. In verse 7 it states, Yes, I will establish my covenant between me and you, and your seed after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, in order to be your God, and your seed's God after you. I will give you and to your seed after you the land where you are an outsider, the whole land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. As a sign of the covenant, all male descendants of Abraham were to be circumcised, including all males present in Abraham's household at the time. Future males were to be circumcised when they were 8 days old, and this sign was to be a covenant in the flesh forever. Sarai's name is also changed to Sarah, princess. Adonai says, Sarai, your wife, so as to indicate which wife, not the handmaiden, but the wife of his youth and choice. Sarai, your wife, will now be called Sarah, and she will be blessed with a son. Abraham laughs, thinking in his heart, Really? A son will be born to a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman? But when Abraham suggests Ishmael as an heir, Adonai is clear that it will not be Ishmael, who is a descendant of Ham and Canaan, but it will be a son born from Sarah, the descendant of Shem, who shall be named Yitzhak. This covenant will be through him and his descendant as an everlasting covenant. Ishmael will also be blessed, but the covenant will be established through Isaac, who will be born at the ordained time the following year. parasha ends with Abraham circumcising all males as instructed, including himself, at age 99 and Ishmael at age 13. So in this parasha, in the beginning, which is the part I'll be chanting from, verses 1 through 4, a theme is introduced that is revisited with many of the prominent biblical figures, and I think it's useful for us today. I won't go into detailing all of the times this theme comes about because I don't want to spoil the story. But Abraham was asked to get up and leave his home, leave his father's house, leave everything with which he was familiar. Adonai didn't even tell him immediately where he was going. Adonai was establishing a covenant relationship between himself and humanity. With Noach, he established a covenant not to do something, but here he was establishing a covenant to establish something else, to build something, to provide a blessing. And this was something that hadn't existed in this form before. But the blessing for humanity would span thousands of years past what Abraham could conceive. And this process began with Abraham being taken away from everything he knew, his entire support structure. Abraham chose to take that first step of the journey on which he was called. He chose to be obedient. And after that, he had little choice but to trust. He stuck with Adonai while venturing through idolatrous cultures. He set up altars all along the way. He is forced to trust that he will have a son as promised. He is forced to trust as circumcision is instituted. He is forced ultimately to trust that the one guiding him is good and his plans should be followed. And later, Abraham would be forced to trust Adonai, that Adonai would provide a sacrifice. The first step was to be taken away from everything he knew, Lech, Lecha, just that single step. The blessing that came about through Abraham's faith has been with us for thousands of years. So it makes me think, what sort of blessings might Adonai be wanting to bring about using us? When Abraham took that first step, he doesn't do any sort of careful deliberation about the risks. He simply steps in. And in general, every step in life is a risk. So let's pray that we have courage to take that first step.